Okay. Hi, everyone. I am very happy to have the chair for our second session. All of you know that you already have the all of the bios on the back of the sheet, unlike the first session, so I'm not going to go through them. And to get us started off, I'm just going to hand it over to Dagmar.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, we're going to try to have this work with the pictures. So, the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, first entered the Bundestag in 2017. It's now firmly ensconced in federal and regional politics and has done very well in the most recent Eastern German elections, although notably there are plenty of West German politicians involved. The liberal Brookings Institute, as recently as 5 years ago, 2019, was asking, quote, is there a coherent AfD ideology, question mark. And without question, the party's leadership and membership is heterogeneous, bringing together some neoliberal economics with the defense of a white welfare state, with Christian conservatism and folkish nationalism. But also the party is not in the least concerned with coherence. In fact, the big tent contradictoriness is actually key to the AfD's success. It keeps people guessing, it expands the base, and it provides deniability. I argue for the AfD as postmodern fascism, and not to bog down in definitional disputes, but just to clarify, by postmodern, I mean a movement that is cleverly self-reflexive and plays gleefully with the inevitable contestedness and instability of truth. Fascist, because it is hostile to the ideals of human equality and solidarity. And yes, I know that many people who vote Trump also think that they're in favor of equality and liberty, but still, there is a way in which fascism is vicious towards all who are really vulnerable. Because it proliferates racialized explanations for what are actually more complicated economic and social dynamics, and not least because it appeals to narcissistic longings for greatness. Also brazen in pushing against legal and cultural norms and limits, inventing concepts and promoting them until they become normalized. The most recent instance is, of course, remigration, the plan to engage in mass deportations of migrants and asylum seekers, a term which quickly lost its shock value precisely as it became ubiquitously discussed. Indeed, the effect of introducing the concept is now other German political parties are debating which migrants are so dutifully hardworking and sufficiently culturally integrated to deserve to be allowed to stay. Another important postmodern element is that present-day fascism don't necessarily require a quote leader. For the German case, I find especially useful Handlinger und Nachweis gekränkte Freiheit. It's translated into English, it's coming out soon, as offended freedom, though we might also call it insulted freedom, which updates the Frankfurt School analyses of the authoritarian personality to identify a new modality of personhood, which they have named libertarian authoritarians, people rebelling in the name of the values of individual self-determination and self-realization. The phenomenon is authoritarian in its hostile warding off of any restrictions on the self, whether those are COVID guidelines or making room for migrants. In other words, any obligation to care or to sacrifice for those who might be more vulnerable. There's 5 things I want to talk about today very briefly. The phenomenon of sexy racism, the party's obsessive anti-disability hostility, some moments of sheer weirdness in the current cultural concern in Germany with smartness, 2 little deep history backstories, and finally, some thoughts on which emotions seem to be involved and what conceptual theoretical models might help us. So point 1, sexy racism. Also with regard to sex and gender, the AfD's messaging is constitutively contradictory. The party is blatantly both anti-gay, most recently with a Stolzmonat, Pride Month, declared 2023 as a homophobic counter to LGBT pride, and it is pro-gay. One of the leaders is openly lesbian. There's an organization of, quote, homosexuals in the AfD, and anti-Muslim racism is promoted by an ad with a gay male couple. Quote, my partner and I don't value the acquaintance of Muslim immigrants for whom our love is a deadly sin. The hetero messaging is also mixed. The party celebrates traditional families and jokingly advocates teen sex and celebrates sensual and proper white motherhood and portrays girls in skimpy bikinis as well as buxom barmaids. And the AFD invokes the threat of rape by men of color, while simultaneously cleverly displaying female nudity in public spaces. For instance, using the Clark Art Museum painting The Slave Market by Léon Gérôme, together with the tagline, "So that Europe does not become Eurabia." As feminist art historian Linda Nochlin pointed out decades ago about this category of painting, there's lots of versions of them, white men got to look at lovely naked flesh and feel indignantly morally superior to men of color at the same time. Again, this AFD poster is, after all, also nudity displayed in public space. Notably, the motif is not so different from many in the Nazi Der Stürmer, which attracted gaggles of teens and other voyeurs, as it was always displayed in glass cases in town squares, and which regularly featured a naked buxom blonde being violated by Jewish men or by snakes with Jewish names. More generally then, I would highlight what I see as the AFD's successful use of sexiness, which other scholars seem not to notice as much, although I think it's one of the strongest echoes between the AFD and the Nazis, who had sexy, wholesome breastfeeding and plenty of lissome nudes. So this is Nazi stuff. And here in 2019, the strategy is campy horror movie obvious. And then here, 2024, it's creepier and more cruel. Speaking of remigration, this is a racism sexiness mashup in the video for the song Remigration Hit. It's an AFD dance party song. We can talk about what many different emotions are in evidence here. I will come back to this video. Point 2, anti-disability hostility. However, the most distinctive, rarely analyzed, but I think super significant feature of the AFD is its messaging about disability, especially cognitive disability. Oh, here's more remigration. Sorry, love ending to the remigration hit. Here's the disability. No other far-right party in the world is positioning itself as hostile to people with impairments and obsessed with saying sly, nasty, cruel things, the way the AFD is. Reveling in a posture of taboo breaking against what it perceives as goody two-shoes kindness, borrowing from the anti-disability playbook time-honored strategies of stirring emotions, above all disgust, and economic anxieties, and the tactic of faux innocently just asking questions. Already in its 2016 party platform, the AFD railed against, quote, ideologically motivated inclusion of children with learning difficulties into mainstream classrooms. I mean, not just that it caused significant expenses, but also would, quote, hamper other children in their learning successes. Once the AFD entered the Bundestag, it got more crass. So in March of 2018, this is the just asking questions technique, the party sought provocatively to stir revulsion against the disabled by presenting a formal inquiry, an Anfrage, to the government with regard to the utterly fabricated issue of migrant families producing supposedly disproportionately more children with cognitive impairments because of the, again, fantasized prevalence of incestuous marriage between blood relatives among the refugees. This turns out to be an anti-Muslim claim, which was actually grafted onto an older anti-Semitic trope from the 1920s. You see the quote here, in which it was contended the Jews produce more cognitively disabled offspring than Gentiles due to their prevalence of marriages between blood relatives. This particular stunt in 2018 did meet with outraged response from disability rights organizations and the churches, but the AFD was undeterred. In April of 2018, picking up the education theme again, candidates self-profiled as demanding an end to a quote, cuddle curriculum, Kuschelunterricht, the implication being that the non-disabled children are not learning anything because the gifted are being slowed down by the presence of the disabled, who just need hugs. And one AFD politician even suggested that if children with Down syndrome spent time together in class with, quote, normal healthy pupils, it was akin to placing people with, quote, severe contagious diseases on a hospital ward together with non-infected persons. The idea that Down syndrome is contagious. And the obsession has persisted through the years since, evident over and over again. I could read you many, many, many party platforms in every region. Most notoriously, in a televised interview in the summer of 2023, prominent AFD member Björn Höcke, who led the campaign in Thuringia that just won 32% of the vote, again attacked inclusion of disabled children in schools on grounds that harms the ability of the non-disabled to become the skilled workers of the future. Healthy societies have healthy schools, he declared. But presently, German children are falling behind in the most basic German and math skills. What's the cause of this dismaying deterioration? Schools, he said, needed urgently to be liberated from ideological projects such as inclusion. Okay, there's a lot to say about this angst around somehow not being a smart enough nation. As one pro-inclusion activist mother of a son endowed with Down asked already some years ago with pithy sarcasm, will 1,000 pupils become stupider just because Henry is sitting there? But an even more crucial point that requires emphasis is that, in fact, inclusion in German schools has not actually happened. It isn't true. It simply cannot be the cause of German pupils' purportedly poor abilities. Signatory countries' compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is recurrently monitored, and Germany is consistently found seriously deficient, with the failure to provide inclusion in schools as one main reason for that assessment. So in fact, children with disabilities of various kinds are all in segregated special schools rather than intermediate. So the AFD's attack on inclusion is not what it pretends to be. It is, we might say, a preemptive counter-revolution. This brings me to point 3, sheer weirdness. So 4 little teensy incidents, odd little scenes of intensity. Bear with me. I learned from the late, great Lauren Berland to pay attention to and wonder at symptomatic details, and that's what I take these to be. So, scene 1. In the conservative German newspaper Die Welt, 3 weeks after the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack, the editor-in-chief of the entire Die Welt youth conglomerate, and it is in turn a subsidiary of the powerful media group Axel Springer, this man, Ulf Borchardt, published a free associative piece entitled The Despisers of the Free West. And it opened with the assertion that Jews in Germany were once again living in fear, not least because of, quote, migrants from the Arab cultural sphere. Borchardt noted that the Shoah was a terrible rupture in civilization, which Germans had admittedly had a large part in causing, and which, quote, makes us bewildered to this day. He praised the Israeli army, deplored the barbarity of Hamas, that Iran-backed terror gang. So far, so routine. But then, amidst elaboration of echoes between the Nazis and Hamas, and whilst noting the, quote, unspeakable suffering that the latter, Hamas, had caused, Borchardt slipped in the notion that Hamas had done so, quote, in the spirit of Amon Gut, Heinrich Himmler, or Joseph Mengele, albeit minus their devilish IQ. Why insist on the IQ of prominent Holocaust perpetrators? Question mark. Okay. Scene 2. A year later, media outlets are reflecting on the anniversary of October 7. And in this context, Matthias Döpfner, CEO of the entire Axel Springer Group, publishes an essay in which he urges that, quote, Germany needs to become more Jewish. Not a terrible idea. But what are his arguments? He proposes that for both altruistic and egotistic reasons, Germany should make it especially easy for Jews to acquire German citizenship. He also promotes a hypothesis that anti-Semitism, past and present, is primarily caused by the emotion of envy. Envy because Jews, he gushes, are so smart and so successful. So many Nobel Prizes, so much impressive wealth. Muslims and Hindus, by contrast, have hardly any Nobel Prizes. The percentages. It's all due, he argues, to the Jewish tradition of love of learning, but also the experience of centuries of persecution, which forces people to excel in that which cannot be taken away from them, their intelligence. Quote, exclusion promotes excellence. In the face of constant discrimination and maltreatment, to survive, you have to be better in all areas, but especially intellectually. He goes on to complain about US universities, and the way, quote, woke activists are insisting that, quote, weak is good and strength is bad. He believes the opposite is true. And he dangles the promise that if Jews were given citizenship en masse, then within 10 years, within the now rather impoverished and declining former East German state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, happens to be about the same size as Israel, one will find, quote, the best German universities, the greatest density of startups, the lowest unemployment rate, and the highest per capita income. Let you draw your own conclusions. But I will say that I was grateful to the German Jewish writer Max Salak for tweeting, this should have been obvious point, that describing Jews as objects of envy due to their smarts and success borders on being an anti-Semitic trope. And I was even more relieved to see documentary filmmaker and social philosopher and I think relevantly, a Habermas specialist, Christian Bettges, providing a detailed analysis of what he quite rightly identified as the bizarrely vulgar Nietzschean implications of Dagmar's text. Scene 3, international synergies. A young Brit who's posted on Substack about, quote, the smartest Nazis by IQ, and a young German, ignore this at our peril is all I can say, and a young German who in 2023 was part of the secret far-right gathering at a Potsdam hotel to plan the mass deportations, dreamed together of creating an elite modeled on the SS and explicitly envisioned a near future AfD-governed Germany for which remigration is a priority, and both race and IQ are major preoccupations for them. Okay, scene 4. Back up a couple of years to 2021. Independent historian Christoph Schneider, a longtime docent guide at the Hadamar Museum and Memorial Center. Hadamar is near Frankfurt Main. It was one of the 6 T4 carbon monoxide gas chamber killing centers for the Nazis' euthanasia program. Christoph Schneider published an essay describing his sorrow and alarm at a phenomenon he'd been noticing with regard to groups of school children who are regularly brought to Hadamar to learn about Nazi crimes against the disabled. Rather than being able to identify with the victims, children, he reports, too often tended to empathize with what they assumed were the dilemmas of the perpetrators. So here's the memorial. Yeah. A discussion among docents led by a communications trainer when he brought the simmering worries to a head. The trainer urging them how to do their job better, right? But the docents should find ways to encourage the visiting children to be able to connect emotionally with the stories of the victims, feel that the topic has something to do with their own lives. Maybe they have a sibling or acquaintance with disabilities, she proposed. Or maybe you need to point out that disability can happen to anyone. Well, you could get sick, have a stroke, become dependent on care. That would never work, one of the docents objected, and she blurted out, quote, I know what they'll say. They'll say, then I'll kill myself. Then I don't want to live. I'll seek assisted suicide. How on earth did young Germans get to a place where the thought of becoming weak and dependent is so dreadful, they'd rather die than require care? Point 4, we're going back deep history. 2 precursor stories reaching back to before the Nazis, but concerning emotions subsequently brought to grotesque extremes by them. Short version of the first precursor story is that the 1890s already saw a proliferation of death wishes being expressed with regard to both disabled newborns and the long-term institutionalized. An obsessively referenced trope had to do with the ancient Spartans, who were said to have left their disabled newborns to die on Mount Taygetus. It was left to biologist Alfred Plutz in 1895. He is the coiner of the term racial hygiene, Rassenhygiene, as the German equivalent of the Anglo-American eugenics, to erotically supercharge the significance of the ancient Spartans by dwelling in detail, not only on their infanticidal practices, but also by presenting them as inspirational in their sexual customs, in which pre- and extramarital intercourse were celebrated when these were likely to produce strong, lovely, and yes, smart offspring. He has a whole thing about how they're going to be intelligence tested. So here we are again with sexy racism, or rather sexy eugenics. But it's more than that. It's sexy euthanasia. My point is that historically, in this touchstone text, lethal malice and erotic arousal were affectively fused. That at least was the thrilling aspirational fantasy. Keep killing off the ugly and weak, and the Germans will become a folk that is strong, lovely, and intelligent. But then, second little story, wham, Germany loses World War I. The win to national pride was, this was a, quote, national humiliation. And I've come to understand that the ensuing rapid diffusion of a particularly vicious and mendacious eugenics needs to be understood as a deliberately constructed corollary to the anti-Semitic stab in the back myth that instead of acknowledging the Imperial German Army had been trounced on the battlefield, blamed the military defeat on the machinations and betrayal of social democrats and Jews on the home front. This was a second stab in the back myth, involving histrionic assessments of the size of the problem of disabled people weighing down the nation, and the idea that the very survival of the nation was at stake, and the insistent propagation of the, let's be clear, scientifically unsustainable, insupportable lie that cognitive deficit was biologically hereditary, as physicians were well aware that it was flawed, and yet blithely fabricated those, quote, theory and evidence. We can talk about this. I want to come to my conclusion. So point 5, emotions and interpretations, back to the present. What does the AFD's combo of insistent sexiness, however silly and middle brow, on the one hand, and obsession not just with insulting, but explicitly demanding to segregate away into special schools and thereby invisibilize disabled children on the other, suggest about what emotions are at work in the party's appeal to voters. So the erotic racism and the Eurabia slave market billboard obviously provided opportunities to feel morally indignant and superior and still get to enjoy looking at the pretty woman, right? The remigration hit video, by contrast, is, I think, deliberately and brazenly affirming, maybe you don't recognize this scene, but the remigration hit video recreated with AI, the infamous May 2024 dance party, these are real people, on the island of Sylt, at which elite young Germans were captured on film singing Deutschland für die Deutschen, Ausländer raus, Germany for the Germans, foreigners out. This is a different kind of arousal or rush. A flagrant display of a felt sense of virile superiority to brown and Black men. I think we can, so it's hard to understand this, but I had to capture something that's actually in motion. But so you see this excitement of remigration, the Aryan blonde guys, and then the crushed brown and Black men who are all wearing their hoodies and dragging their suitcases and being remigrated. I mean, I think we can read here a shift over the 5 years between 2019 and 2024 from sexualized danger mongering. So that hasn't gone away. In fact, other parties now, from the Christian Democrats to the Greens, are jumping on that bandwagon to what I would consider a mode of full-on braggadocio, where Schadenfreude reigns. And as Adam Serwer put it about Trumpism, the cruelty is the point. There is apparently delicious pleasure in being able to cause hurt. Or as Slavoj Žižek put it during that phase in the 90s when he was making lots of sense, the secret memo of fascism to its followers is not repressive. On the contrary, it's a message of license and impunity. You may. Or as political theorist Robin Marasco notes, it's all about participation in power. Still, why does the AFD put quite so much time and energy to preemptively resisting inclusion of children with learning challenges in regular schools? What is that all about? Why bother? Here's where I want us to think together about how looking at anti-disability hostility reveals things we don't notice quite as clearly when we consider other racisms. So there's 3 possible interpretations I can think of. We could read it, the anti-disability obsession, as reflecting insecurity. I think the important point that this is a really genuinely important point. The wannabe dominant group is never naturally dominant, right? I mean, white people are not smarter than Black people. It's nonsense, right? It's bullshit. But it's always just a pathetic fantasy of superiority. Think bell curve, right? And indeed, AFD politicians admit that non-disabled German children are having trouble with reading and math. Or 2, the insulting of the disabled has the additional function of flattering the merely average person as being at least not disabled. Akin to David Rudiger's point about the wages of whiteness. Here it would be the wages of ableness. But by now, 3, I have come to think that it has a third further function, and that is the deliberate teaching of unkindness, systematically pursued intentional extirpation of practiced human reflexes of empathy and solidarity. And I hope we can talk about this further. Okay.
Okay. It's quite an act to follow, but I shall try. And thanks so much for the invitation and to everybody for being here. So, in April 1967, Theodor Adorno delivered a paper to a socialist student society at the University of Vienna, aspects of the new right-wing extremism. sketching an analysis of the then recent electoral emergence of the neo-Nazi Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschland's NPD. I believe is now called the Heimat, if I'm not mistaken. Drawing on 4 decades of collective theorizing and social research on capitalism's fascist potentials and pathologies. This talk, only published after about half a century after it was delivered, is peppered with living insights about the political phenomenology of post-war reaction. Fascism's, whether in discussing the imago of communism, which I think is an important formulation, in the absence of the real thing, fascism's anti-theoretical animus, or what Adorno delightfully calls the pseudoscientific pedantry that dominates far-right discourse. For the purposes of our conversation, I want to touch on a passage where Adorno defines a political emotion, or a political historical emotion perhaps, that he deems central to the psychosocial fortunes of right-wing extremism, what he terms the feeling of social catastrophe. What this feeling mediates are the social conditions for fascism which have endured beyond Hitler's downfall. Namely, for Adorno, writing in 1967, an overwhelming tendency towards the concentration of capital, which is accompanied by the clear and present danger of déclassement for social classes anxious to retain their privileges and entitlements, however miserable these latter may be. The feeling of or for social catastrophe is rooted in lived experience and fantasies of loss and obsolescence grounded in effective and actual political economic dynamics. Adorno particularly speaks of what he terms the specter of technological unemployment, a theme still very present, of being made redundant by automation. And this means that even those endowed with wages and seeming job security already, as he puts it, feel potentially superfluous. To conjoin a formulation from Marx's Grundrisse with an earlier title that had been given to the authoritarian personality, the virtual pauper can morph into the potential fascist. Now, Adorno in his 1967 talk, as in several of his writings on fascism, does not tire of warning that psychological explanations for far-right ascendancy are partial at best, while simultaneously warning about overly simplistic correlations between social crisis and the rise of reaction. It is here that the temporality, and we could say the historicity of the feeling of social catastrophe plays a crucial role. For Adorno, it is more in their orientation towards crisis than in their response to it that the forces of reaction find their advantages. In their propaganda and prognostications, they are masters at anticipating terror. And I just wanted to quote from what I think is one of the key observations in this talk. Adorno says, one might speak of a distortion of Marx's theory of collapse that takes place in this very crippled and false, fortunate term, in this very crippled and false consciousness. On the one hand, on the rational side of things, they ask, what will happen if there is a big crisis? Very rational question. And that is where these movements are attractive. On the other hand, they want the catastrophe. They feed off apocalyptic fantasies of the kind that, as it happens, could also be found among the Nazi leadership, as documents show. If I had to speak psychoanalytically, I would say that of the forces mobilized here, the appeal to the unconscious desire for disaster, catastrophe, is by no means the least significant in these movements. But this feeling, end of quote, but this feeling is rooted in a class standpoint for which the ambivalent orientation towards catastrophe, imagining it, fearing it, wanting it, is overdetermined by a rejection of any social transformation that could avert that catastrophe, but would also have done with one's group identity and special prerogatives. As Adorno observes, someone who is unable to see anything ahead of them and does not want the social foundation to change, that's the key combination, really has no alternative but, like Richard Wagner's Wotan, to say, do you know what Wotan wants? The end. This person, from the perspective of their own social situation, longs for demise, though not demise for their own group, as far as possible, the demise of all. I'll return by way of conclusion to this Wagnerian cry of the petty bourgeoisie, but I wanted first to frame Adorno's diagnosis of the emotional catastrophism of the far right in terms of the place of pessimism within its genealogy. Adorno himself, in that talk, mentions the documented apocalypticism that coursed through National Socialism itself. The French historian Johann Chapoutot, in a study of Nazism's obsession with Greek and Roman antiquity and with racial explanations for their demise, has written illuminatingly of how the Nazis, this is a quote, utopian philosophy of the will was consistently shadowed and in the regime's collapse overtaken by a feral, desperate eagerness to envision Nazism's own demise. For what mattered was not so much victory in real life as a symbolic triumph of sublime, heroic defeat in memory, which would survive through the process of myth. End of quote. It was precisely this choreography of catastrophe that lay at the heart of Walter Benjamin's analysis of fascism as the aestheticization of politics in the work of art essay. For Benjamin, fiat ars pereat mundos was a fascist motto, speaking to a vision of humanity where, in his famous words, self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. Mussolini himself mused to a journalist in the 1920s that fascism will end, but it will have lived, thanks to exaltation, and I am exaltation. What is crucial to my mind is that this belief and even desire in the inevitability of downfall, be it in a more biological or cultural, cyclical or elliptic register, which structure the fascist worldview, was articulated as a racial pessimism. This was a title, Racial Pessimism, of the 1923 presidential address to the American Sociological Society delivered by its then president, Ulysses Grant Weatherly. I turn to this text because it provides a striking illumination into an interwar mood belonging to what Richard Oberg termed the morbid age, which preceded and exceeded the organized far right and its fellow travelers. Framing a capacious review of the declinist social theories of his time, Weatherly depicts the Great War as a moment that could be perceived, and these are his words, as if a sardonic world spirit has suddenly arrested the Occident in the flower of its boasted culture in order to audit an overdue account. Clear metaphor. And the question guiding this audit, again, from the president of what is today the American Sociological Association, was, is the white race, as the special exponent of that system, threatened with extinction, or at least with loss of hegemony? Key sociological question for American sociologists in 1923. Some of Weatherly's own summaries in the article foretell the rhetoric of a J.D. Vance on the plague of childlessness. I just give you this passage because it was too ridiculous to let pass. Others bemoan the world wariness of our surfeited intellectuals who refuse to undertake parenthood, dreading to project offspring into a sordid existence on the theory, I suppose, that the process of generation, if continued, would always produce little tired radicals. It is useful in any case to reflect on how in 1923, the peril of the white race, one of the subheadings in this essay, could be maybe even the central question to be dealt with by an assembly of very mainstream American sociologists whose empirical anchor was what Weatherly called racial displacement on a world scale. Whether in the racist tracks of Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant, or in Mussolini's 1932 statement that, quote, the entire civilization of the white race can disintegrate, weaken, grow dim in a disorder without aim, a misery without tomorrow. The philosophy of history and Stimmung of racial pessimism is a core determinant of a far-right mindset that retains remarkable mobilizing potential a century later. It is indisputable that the pessimistic preoccupation with miscegenation, denatalism, World War I is a civil war between whites, and the racial entropy and devitalization instigated by democracy, finance, urbanization, or feminism are profoundly and powerfully overdetermined and conditioned, I would argue, by the perception of a crisis of the colonial order and of the coming colored world revolution, to borrow Oswald Spengler's formulation from the 1931 techniques. And you can find shadows of this also very much in Mussolini's writings. In the late fascism book, I quote in particular his preface to a book. Spengler and Mussolini prefaced a book on this problem of denatalism by a German demographer who ended up writing Richard Korher, the report on the final solution that is then the kind of key text, key document in a sense, internal document. The Holocaust, and in that text, Mussolini goes on about what was supposed to be, I could never find any source of this, but supposed to be some riot in Harlem that showed him, the coming power of the darker nations over the white world, right? So it's a very old theme. Interwar fascism in this respect can also be understood as a planetary salvage operation for white supremacy in a temporal and effective horizon of decline which might be eventual, postponable, perhaps inevitable. Donna Jones has underscored in a very perceptive essay, published I think in the journal Clio, how, though as she puts it, deeply antagonistic to the colonized and any prospect of their ascent, rightist historiographies, while paranoid, did what no other history had done heretofore, granted recognition in Europe, obviously, granted recognition to the historicity of Europe's subjects. From a position of dread rather than curiosity, Europe envisions a future in which the non-Western world reaches a state of coeval. It's intriguing here as a sort of parenthetic matter on which French scholar Mathieu Renaud has written a lot, that of course, Spengler's Decline of the West was an immensely popular book amongst Black radical and anti-colonial intellectuals. C.L.R. James weirdly said that along with Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, it turned into Marxism. The text is quoted repeatedly, as well as Hour of Decision in the Crisis, and by Du Bois, read, refunctioned in this antagonistic way, which Jones talks about. In a distinct, if related vein, in his unfinished work on the anthropology of what he called cultural apocalypses, the end of the world, Ernesto de Martino had tried to articulate dialectically the millenarian movements triggered by the world unmaking forces of colonialism with the way in which what he called apocalypse without an eschaton that coursed through the Euro-America's literature and ideology of crisis could not be thought outside the horizon of decolonization and its threat to white hegemony. Cultural pessimism was a racial pessimism. Writers and thinkers of the far right could even draw on the early Nietzsche speculation, on the Aryan roots of Greek tragedy. Nietzsche, interestingly, had borrowed from Burckhardt the adage, pessimism of worldview, optimism of temperament, long before Gramsci's famous refunctioning of Romain Rolland, to argue that pessimism bore an intimate kinship with whiteness. This, for instance, is what Gottfried Benn wrote in 1943 in his book, The World of Expression. The thought of the white race is pessimistic. It is the element of its creativeness. Pessimism is a legitimate spiritual principle, a very ancient one, which found genuine expression in the white race and which will interweave with the future, supposing it still possesses the metaphysical power to incorporate and assimilate. This vision of whiteness as a culture of tragedy and its downfall as a tragedy of culture is firmly ensconced in what the Germanist and mythologist Furio Jesi, who I talk about in my book, called the Religio Mortis, or religion of death. That was a pillar of white culture. Racial pessimism made reflexive and militant, or activist pessimism in Emilio Gentile's formulation, is one possible definition of fascism. An answer to Nietzsche's question from the attempt at self-criticism that prefaced his 1886 edition of The Birth of Tragedy, newly subtitled Hellenism or Pessimism. Is pessimism necessarily a sign of decline, decay, degeneration, weary and weak instincts? Is there a pessimism of strength? Now, it would be an easy and perhaps bitterly these days diverting exercise to employ Nietzschean diagnostic categories, perhaps filtered through Deleuze's reading, to see in the persistence of racial pessimism in today's far right, with its obsession with ideologies or memes like white genocide, the Great Replacement, and so on, a textbook case of ressentiment and the operation of reactive forces at a mass scale, a pseudo-politics and hyper-politics of rage. I won't follow this tack today, but wanted instead to think briefly what becomes of pessimism, racial pessimism included, when the material coordinates of our historicity are transformed, notwithstanding the seemingly inert character of fears of substitution and déclassement that appear in distressingly similar, indeed, pretty much plagiarized guises from the 1920s to the 2020s. Simply by way of sketching a hypothesis for further research and further discussion, I think we need to attend to two axes of collective temporal experience that inflect that feeling of social catastrophe, which Adorno rightly indicated as a leitmotif of far-right politics and a cause for its appeal. The first rhymes with Adorno's turn to the prospect of technological unemployment as among the chief social conditions for the resurgence of reaction. As many critical political economists have analyzed, we live in an age of capitalist stagnation, where super profits and eye-watering social inequality accompany sluggish productivity and indifferent growth, as well as extremely deeply rooted experiences of precarity, rent, debt, and so on that we've already. Especially in the long wake of the 2007-8 crisis, the collective social experience of increasing precariousness and diminishing horizons, as well as a retrocession from the aspirations and chances of previous generations, makes up the very atmosphere of our politics. And of the increasing disaffection and disaffiliation that vast swathes of the global population feel, political systems and regimes with symbolic power is extremely brittle. Second, especially I would argue when it is denied, disavowed, or minimized, the reality of eco-social catastrophe in the form of global heating is at the core of contemporary pessimism. It overdetermines its politics of walls and drawbridges, its penchant for contradictory forms of autarky, as well as multiple instantiations of what Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective have termed fossil fascism. Beyond its murderous fringes, namely the accelerationist communiques of racist mass shooters, the pessimism of today's far right is hardly tragic. Narratives of racial or national displacement are accompanied by the suggestion or the promise that supremacy and affluence could be durably restored and secured. Yes, the present tendency is American carnage or German or Italian or what have you, but a nationalist renaissance is possible, mass deportations permitting. This instantiation of racial pessimism, which can also be partially inclusive, if contradictorily, of a multiracial nationalism, but materially anchored in the military and financial infrastructure here of US dominance, certainly differs from a key promise of fascism's interwar activist pessimism. At least in its rhetoric, it is not expansionist, it wants primacy, but it does not want to work for hegemony. Confronted with the pessimism of the far right, conclusion, as well as arrival optimisms and linear philosophies of histories of liberalism, social democracy, and a kind of Stalinized Bolshevism, some dissident thinkers of the 1920s, that same moment of racial pessimism on the far right, wagered that the forces of pessimism could be wrested from reaction. The communist and surrealist intellectual Pierre Naville derided right-wing obsessions with the end of the white race or the decline of Latin civilization, plainly ridiculous fantasies of déclassé intellectuals, arguing instead that political and aesthetic radicalism required embracing the collapse of certain forms of liberal humanism, cultivating a certain sense of loss and desertion, and advancing despair as a virulent, scintillating, and creative passion. Any pessimism that did not work to negate contemporary social conditions, that did not lay claim to what he provocatively called the right to modern disaster, was not worthy of the name. In a remarkable 1929 essay on surrealism, as what he called the last snapshot of the European intelligentsia, Dr. Benjamin made Naville's call to organize pessimism his own and wrote, "Surrealism has come ever closer to the communist response, and this means pessimism from start to finish, positively and absolutely. Mistrust in the fate of literature, mistrust in the face of freedom, mistrust in the face of European humanity, but of all mistrust, mistrust, and mistrust in every kind of rapprochement between classes, between people, between individuals. An unlimited trust only in IG Farben and the peaceful perfecting of the Air Force." This polemical, sardonic, and disturbingly premonitory motto, clearly marked by Benjamin's close collaboration with Brecht over these years, speaks of an effort to craft a kind of effective disposition on the far left, one that would have done with those political emotions, would have done without those political emotions that are anchored in the temporality of an idea of progress that might appear full of human promise, but is contaminated at its core by the empty time of capitalism. As a historical repertoire of far-right pessimism once again becomes a fertile source for reactionary myth-making, it might also be an opportune time to revisit this minor tradition of communist pessimism. Thank you.
I feel like in some ways we should have done this the opposite way because my talk is going to be very like materials that would be extremely helpful for you and not me to interpret and philosophize about because I am so much not an academic. I do a podcast and I'm a journalist, and that means that my talk will be a lot more vulgar and prosaic and fragmented and by comparison, frankly, kind of dumb. I feel like I'm a little tired radical. I don't think I was produced by all these people think, but nonetheless, a little tired radical. But basically, this will just be a kind of anecdotal dispatch from the world of young, self-understood, dissident conservatives in Washington, D.C., based on a series of conversations I had with a somewhat arbitrarily chosen group of these young men, mostly in the days before and after the 2024 election. So interesting conversations, if often frustrating and despairing for me. I'd also add that my contribution, by dint of my own habits of mind and inadequacies as a journalist, will tend to take my subjects sort of more at their word, as opposed to uncovering the deeper ideologies, ideological truths or illusions underlying their self-understanding. You guys can do that. That's why you're here. So when I'm done with my talk, we can do a lot more interpretation. Although, of course, because I'm going to be mostly summarizing and paraphrasing the sorts of things they told me, there will obviously be a certain amount of interpretation that I get to do without you guys even knowing. So the sort of background for this is that sometime in 2021, I started corresponding with some of these young conservatives. A lot of them I met through the podcast, or maybe I met a few through the podcast, and then they introduced me to other people. We have a kind of small but vocal audience of self-understood conservatives, even though our podcast is very clearly and explicitly from a left-wing perspective. They at least enjoy hearing some of the history of their ideas and movements that I think sometimes are starved for even within the institutions of the right. And maybe even because we're a little bit less giving them the court history, they find that they get more out of it. A very small number of our listeners, but they're out there. And so I met some of them through that, started corresponding with them. And I wrote an article about this a few years ago. And with a few important, well, I say this, they tend to be associated with sociologically, they tend to be associated with magazines. They're high achieving graduates of elite universities, or sometimes the right's alternative places of prestige and higher learning. So places like Hillsdale College, Grove City College, evangelical schools, where a lot of conservative intellectuals teach and try to find new young conservatives to fill those magazines and think tanks in DC. Some of them are activists or involved in advocacy, but most of them are writers. And with a few important exceptions, my sources are associated with what was then in 2021, especially being called the new right, the newest of many new rights. And every country has had many new rights. But those currents, the new right currents, could broadly be defined as those groups are trying to provide an intellectual scaffolding for Trumpism, simultaneously trying to define and interpret the meaning of Trump's breakthrough in American politics. So as I wrote of those people a few years ago, hold on, take a drink. They were populist culture warriors, cohered as much by temperament as ideology, and by certain fiercely held enmities. Some are quote unquote national conservatives who, like the reformicons of the 2010s, support pro-family welfare policy and reject the GOP's tax-cutting orthodoxy. NatCons, as they're known, also tend to be China and immigration hawks who want an industrial policy for the heartland. Others consider themselves post-liberal localists in the vein of Patrick Deneen and Rod Dreher. Deneen, who wrote Why Liberalism Failed, and Rod Dreher, who's the irascible Eastern Orthodox blogger and author of The Benedict Option, a spirited argument for Christian retreat from the turpitude of public life into virtuous communal separatism. Others are Roman Catholic integralists, self-described integralists, aspiring to a theologically ordered politics. Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule and University of Dallas politics professor and American Affairs editor Gladden Papin are their touchstones. Whichever denomination they prefer, new rightists tend to agree that classical liberalism, of the sort embraced by previous generations of conservatives, has a big hole in the middle of it where a substantive concept of the good should be. Quote, my core belief is just that you can't be a libertarian, one of my correspondents, who then considered himself an integralist, told me back in 2021. You have to be something. All law is imbued with moral character, he said. Let's stop pretending otherwise and just acknowledge which morals we're trying to legislate and then commit ourselves to them. In the weeks leading up to the 2024 election, as I mentioned, I reached back out to several of these sources to see how their lives and views had changed the past 3 years, and then to get their thoughts about the election before and after. Some life changes for these guys. Some had stayed at magazines, one moving up the ranks of a major paleoconservative outlet from associate editor all the way up to senior editor, and then had moved on to work for a prominent right-wing donor doing his sort of ideological side work for this guy. One had become a prominent reporter of the wokeness run amok beat. Again, that's editorializing, obviously, on my part. He doesn't describe it that way, but reporting out features about the perceived excesses of DEI departments on elite colleges campuses. Another had worked for Ron DeSantis's presidential campaign as a speechwriter, but unlike many of the most dedicated DeSantis, people didn't turn on Trump during or after the primary. There was a lot of bad blood between those camps that they're kind of figuring it out now because, you know, winning makes everybody happy. And the others, besides those, tended to be working at one or the other of the foundations, think tanks, or news outlets that are sometimes collectively referred to, even by their beneficiaries, as the conservative welfare state, which is to say, you don't have to be that talented to get a bunch of money sent your way by billionaire and millionaire donors to do, you know, thinking and writing. It's great. It really works out for them. Now I'm just going to sort of, this is where it gets fragmented because I tied a lot of different conversations. I'm just drawing out some of the things we talked about, some themes. When we get to the questions, if there's certain things you're interested to hear, if I learned from these people that we didn't talk about, we can talk about those things. But I'll just bring up a few things so that we don't do this forever. One person we talked about a lot, unsurprisingly, was J.D. Vance. This is their guy. He's the avatar of their politics and their style. From their perspective, he's going to be, is now and will be in the White House surrounded by smart, serious people who share their worldview. One of the people I talked to who is sort of softly anti-Trump, he thinks January 6th was a bad thing, for example, said he probably wouldn't vote and doesn't really care. If Trump wins, thanks to Vance, he'll have friends with interesting jobs in the administration, access. And if Harris wins, maybe the right will finally learn its lessons about Trump. I told him I doubted that. But also for his sake, there will be more woke outrages to report on under a Harris administration than under a Trump one, perhaps. As one of them said of Vance, quote, they were calling him weird. And yeah, he's kind of weird, a weird, nerdy guy, but so am I. That's why I like him. If the intellectual new right will have a direct line to the White House, these kinds of people, it will be through Vance. They're eager to see who he hires for his staff. There's some good signs on this front for their aspirations. I just saw today that Gail Slater was hired to work on tech policy for the transition. She's an economic advisor to Vance's Senate office, formerly of the FTC and also various tech companies, but a kind of like softly antitrust right-wing economist. What's notable about this love for Vance in some ways, and what's more notable about it, the fact that he's actually going to be in the White House, is that I had sort of dismissed Vance in my 2021 piece because I thought he represented some of the internal contradictions of the new right intellectuals. That Vance was attempting to impose his sort of politics of austere communal obligation and piety, a sort of Puritan heritage in the conservative movement, on a movement, meaning the Trump movement, whose base and whose shock troops and people who tended to vote for him, or certainly people who show up for his rallies, were primarily motivated more by the sort of folk libertarian tradition that is ironically much more the heritage of Vance's hillbilly ancestors. That Vance, by sort of exiting from his hillbilly past and you know, selling them out in his famous book that we all read, he had adopted, you know, in some ways, the conservative variant of the kind of northeastern New England piety that he would have learned at Yale, and previous generations of Yaleys would have learned much more so. But what it turns out is that Vance is a cannier operator than I had anticipated, and that kind of mix of experiences and ideological and political genealogies is perhaps what has made him able to operate in the space that he's in. And I'll come back to that at the end here. On the Trump world, a lot of these conversations ended up being about like, who's going to get jobs? Am I going to get a job? I hope I get a job, after Trump won. But one of the people I talked to who was less of a Trumper and more suspicious of some of the other people I talked to, said something interesting about kind of the change from drain the swamp to the present. He says they're happy to turn DC into a self-dealing oligarchy as long as they're the oligarchs, which is something that, of course, I agree with. And a thing that's related to that, that another person told me was that he felt angry at these sort of self-described populists that they view the people as a whole, the people out there voting for Trump, as something that they can use to achieve their own self-advancement. They look out at people outside of DC and think, oh, look, ammunition and fuel for my rise to power. And that's kind of disgusting to me. So that person I agreed with. Overall, people I talked to said that this kind of young conservative operative is much less sheepish than they used to be about their support for Trump before and after the election. They used to say things like, he's a flawed but useful, and probably necessary vehicle for our politics, a battering ram against, woke orthodoxy and the Reaganite, consensus. But now it's more like, I really like this guy. He's completely normalized to them. I think that a similar thing, my impression from some people I talked to, a similar thing has sort of happened with Silicon Valley. The taboo against Trump was removed for various reasons, but one theory that one of my sources pointed out was that the platforms tried to appease liberals over disinformation and speech regulation, and nobody was satisfied. They reasoned that the GOP is just less likely to put them in the position of having to decide what to censor and not. And so they're on board with Trump. Again, I'm not saying that exactly, but more moderate conservatives that I spoke to, what they expressed was this, whether or not this is true, that they thought that Trump was an accelerant of wokeness, of the resistance movements, of the anti-police movements, of all kinds of mobilized left-wing activism that took place during Trump's time in office, and they hoped that Biden would be, a calming. The return of the institutionalist is kind of how he sold himself to Democrats, and that they have observed that did not take place from their perspective. And their number one example of this was the anti-Israel, anti-war, anti-genocide protests on college campuses, which they took to be the worst thing they've ever seen. But there's more to say about that too, because it gets complicated. I also heard some trepidation about whether Trump really has the juice anymore. Most of these conversations took place before he won, because people were just riding too high after Tuesday. But paraphrasing, people described him seeming tired, enervated, not as energetic or radical as he was in 2015 and 2016, that he'd been assimilated, that it's true that he changed the Republican Party and he changed the conservative movement, but that it also changed him. Partially, it's just he got older, the exhaustion from the lawsuits and blah, blah, blah. But from this person's perspective, at least, he seemed to be running a more conventional campaign than he did in 2015, 2016. And that campaign resulted in a much more conventional Republican administration than this person had hoped for, and that he feared moves in that direction towards Bushism. Probably something not a lot of you are feeling right now. in other words, this is me. They wish Trump was going to be more hardcore, more like the dictator in waiting that liberals fear that he'll be, but they don't actually think that's going to happen. They're pessimistic. Let's see, I don't want to just go on and on. Another thing I heard in this sort of, is Trump really gonna be the guy, be the avatar of our grievances and be really hardcore, was some amount of fear about him being surrounded by his new billionaire friends, Elon Musk, Bill Ackman, who likely have a lot of influence over the transition. I saw today or yesterday that Axios was reported a piece, "Behind the Curtain, Washington's open for business. Trump will fill his top ranks with billionaires, former CEOs, tech leaders, and loyalists." And to remind you, the people that I'm talking to at least conceive of themselves as like a anti-corporate, or at least not as invested in free market orthodoxy as the old Republican, old guard. And so that's disturbing to them. Somebody said to me, if these people win out, it's going to be tax cuts and a lot of money for Israel, and that's about it. And that's, this person said, I don't want more fucking corporate tax cuts. We've had enough corporate tax cuts. Another thing I heard is that the mood is euphoric, but it's about to get very ugly. That the competition to staff the administration to fill up the transition is going to be produce a lot of infighting in different factions of the Beltway right, and especially a concern amongst young people in the higher echelons of the conservative operative staffer class is that they're all on these group chats with each other where they say awful racist things all the time. And if you're on the wrong end of somebody's political capital who doesn't want you to get a job in the administration, those things are going to start leaking. So that'll be fun for us, perhaps. I wanted to mention about, 2 minutes? Okay. I wanted to mention about Gaza and Israel that there's, despite what I said about the concern about the campus protests, there are changing norms amongst young conservatives about Zionism. That a lot of younger people in the DC conservative world, especially if they associate more with the dissident side of things, are unlikely to be in private unabashedly pro-Israel. Some of them are actual anti-Semites. Their milieus obviously have few antibodies to resist that kind of thinking. But there are some who at least officially have taken the sort of isolationist perspective of the Trump world seriously, the America First nationalism, and wonder whether the US's unconditional funding of Netanyahu's brutal war actually serves American interests, the same way they're asking that kind of question about Ukraine and Russia. There's been some controversy both internally, and some of it's leaked out at various think tanks amongst young right-wingers who are not sufficiently pro-Zionist for the people who are paying them. And maybe finally, I would just end on, I could bring all of this stuff up when we talk. I think something we talked about a bit is weirdness. You mentioned weirdness. Weirdness is a symptom, something to pay attention to. Obviously, the Democratic campaign tried to look at how weird these people are as a strategy for a time. One of my sources who remains sort of more of a Reaganite than a lot of these other people felt very vindicated by the disaster of the DeSantis campaigns because he didn't really run the way he governed or campaigned for governor, and that he was much more so than Trump, the candidate of the two online right, that he had leaned into their boutique policy ideas and their off-putting aesthetics, letting all these young anonymous accounts on Twitter make videos for him, which ended up damaging his campaign with normal Republicans. And I think this brings me back to the Trump-Vance ticket. I had written a few years ago, the conservative elites, not unlike their most progressive counterparts, are sometimes too weird to lead the revolution. Many of the things that attract elite conservatives to the new right, a thick sense of traditional morality, a communitarian ethos, a revolt against licentious, modern excess, sublime integration of spiritual and political in life, and political life and punishing antiquarian modes of religious worship bewilder and annoy their prospective electoral base, which is composed primarily, as I said, of sort of folk libertarian Trump voters, which I still think that Matthew Walter's term, the Barstool conservatives, the sort of fratty libertine perspective, like to scandalize overbearing libs and flouting their social norms and niceties, but more or less wanting to live, a life unencumbered by feminism and or by the church. Is sort of what the Trump movement tends to represent at its base. Trump and Vance, and we can talk about this more. To me, it seems like if the fact that they were successful does seem to be, and whether the two of them, their personalities and their ideologies can be held together through the course of this administration or productively held together, might be very important for the future of the American right. Vance representing the weird, Trump representing also the weird, but the less, more licentious weird.
Thank you to all three of you, and looking forward to hearing your questions. I'm going to be keeping a list, so just try to catch my eye. And Sam is going to be tabulating questions that are coming in over the internet, so we will alternate way. Start here.
Well, now I'm completely depressed. I have a question for Dagmar. It was absolutely fascinating and horrifying talk. But a lot of what you talk about with the off day is you find, in the United States, you find it among the Lupinists, but some of it seems very specifically German. Some of the weirdnesses you talk about also, particularly the emphasis on disability. And given the now, very long stretch of time between the fall of the Third Reich and now, how do you explain this? Do you see this as a kind of rediscovery where these people are actually going out and they're reading history books and thinking, oh yeah, that worked for Himmler, that sounds great, let's try it? Or are there intermediary figures, particularly throughout the history of the Federal Republic in West Germany, who were really serving as bridges and, in much smaller movements than the AfD has become, but bridging this and allowing and serving as a relay for some of these ideas, and particularly, if you know anything about the disability, is this something that continued in West Germany that you saw? So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit more.
Really quickly, that we can have a whole book length conversation about it. It took 40 years for anyone to give a shit that the disabled had been sterilized or murdered. They didn't count as one. Right? It was an unbelievable cover up and rewriting reality job. The public and media identification was with the perpetrators, not with the victims. They were covered with shame. The Nazi propaganda was just pervasive. And it was not until the 1970s and 80s that a subset of amazing radicals, both in West and communist East Germany, totally rethought how to think about disability and care and education and came up with an alternate paradigm. And that paradigm was enormously inspirational. It brought us the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It did a lot of amazing things. And that is what is under our assault now. Okay, so there is a continuity and then a backlash against it, a preemptive. We don't want to actually live out what that UN Convention that we signed under America. I would say the obsession with IQ is here in the United States too. I don't know if you followed that Trump called Kamala a low IQ person, and that he is yesterday just praising Elon Musk. Melania did not show up for the photo op. Elon Musk is part of the family and he's a genius. And I kid you not, you take this stuff serious, it's unbelievable. And I would say 2 months ago, I had a working class man, Mexican-American in my home fixing something, and you saw a lot of Jewish Holocaust stuff on the walls and in the books, and he started to talk to me about it and wanted to know whether Hitler had a high IQ. And I said, I know he was evil, but he had a high IQ, right? And I said, no, he was like a loser. It was the complete, no, it's like ridiculous. And, failed painter. And then after he left, I was disconcerted because then I saw the Reddit chains and I saw the amount of obsession now with Nazi IQ. It's like a huge theme, right? This whole thing about who's smart and who's not, this notion of the social Darwinism that is now coming up again, that's specific to our historical moment, but it's an echo with 100 years
Sorry, I've also got a question for Dagmar. I was really thought it was thought-provoking what you were saying about this philo-Semitism of the mass migration. There's a mass migration to Germany that Merkel lets in of people from the Middle East. Then there's this right-wing backlash, which I didn't realize they were calling remigration. And now there's this fantasy of mass deporting people from the Middle East and importing Jews. Obviously, there's a long history of fantasies and then, or ideologies of moving Jews about, but never really moving Jews in that way. So I was wondering what you think about this kind of philo-Semitic anti-Semitism. Whether you could say anything more on that.
I mean, I would say that a sensitive Holocaust consciousness was an enormous achievement of the left, the grassroots thing that started in the 70s and 80s, inspired by Adorno's writings and his students and so on, and a deep sense that we want to be a different kind of people. And what has happened since then is that Holocaust consciousness in Germany has gotten hijacked from within and is an instrument of the right to shut down anything that's leftist or anything that is pro-sensitivity towards the migrants. So we had a brief shining moment of solidarity between Jews and Muslims in Germany, and that is now gone. That doesn't mean that there aren't many amazing German Jews who are like saying, not in our name, please don't do this. But the German government just passed a law about how it's going to be monitoring what is speakable in all cultural venues. Anything that you want to have funding for, you can no longer have a Palestinian rights activist and a leftist Jew in conversation in an academic setting. You will not get funding for that. Totally intense.
Stuff.
Dagmar, I've asked a lot of questions though for many years, so I'm going to leave you out of this
Leave me
one.
alone.
So, Alberto, I was trying to understand whether you were sort of reveling in the vagueness and the differences between the different varieties of pessimism that you brought in, or if there are very clear lines between them, or if you have ways of distinguishing them between, something that's more compelling, let's say now, versus versions that are far freakier, if you're thinking of it much more as a diagnostic category rather than something else, or parts of it is something that would easily get disavowed, whereas others would get picked up. That's half a question. And for some, there was something about the way that you talked about I don't even want to use the word group exactly that you discussed. You put in a priority, let's say, on the sociological aspect to this, on the competitions between them, on their eagerness to sort of be in some respects relatively close, but in others to have relatively hard lines.
Yeah.
Is there a kind of ideological argument or an intellectual argument as to where fault lines are? I didn't mean to be asking everybody for fault lines. But is there a kind of intellectual argument? Are there ideas at which they go? Are there moments of conversion that get really interesting in the story? And do you tend to think that this is a sign of intellectual creativity, of a kind of vibrant movement, or a moment in which, let's say, the sociological fissures are enough so that, like, it sort of depends who brings you in and that's where you end up, kind of situation?
That's a really important question. I've only sort of started to try and map this out for myself. So I suppose I'd want to say a couple of things. The first is that, the first point is just to underscore that we tend maybe to underestimate this dimension of the thinking and the structure of feeling of the far right, both historically and in the present. But also to say that certainly in its formation in the interwar period, I think there's been fairly massive neglect of how significant, once you know how significant what Spengler called the colored world revolution or the anticipated horizon of decolonization was to the mindset and projects and so on, you can't really unsee it, right? And then all sorts of things that I think were just people just didn't really, the glossed over, let's say, become very, very pertinent and worth engaging with. Now, it was fairly quick at the end, but I think one of the things that's striking on the one hand, we have this massive continuity where there are imaginaries of replacement, displacement, loss of privilege, et cetera, that are formulated in roughly identical ways. Texts that are, and some of these texts, some of the great replacement material actually is from the 70s, so that's also interesting in its own right. But they repeat, not with so many differences, except they, of course, exist in extremely different political and social conjunctures, right? And that's where what I still don't really have the means or methods to suss out is, in what way does that persistent trope of racial pessimism, how is it then articulated with very different temporalities and experiences, on the one hand of economic crisis, and then of something which was not part of the temporal horizon of expectation of the interwar period, i.e. climate collapse, global heating, and so on, right? And I think that's where also there's real material, and you could even say real geopolitical dimensions to those isolationist imaginaries that were just discussed as well, right? So the fact that the counter to the racial pessimism is not expansion, is not, except for in a bizarre form of sympathy and fantasy, settler colonial dispossession. I mean, yes, in Israel, but not, it's not. So there's also a deeply, a deeply anxious and conservative dimension of it, which of course then, aside from the, accelerationist, racist, murderous fringes, means that the apocalyptic dimension of it, the Nero decree, burn it all down, kind of that's far less present, because in some sense there's fantasies and realities of mass violence, including the ones that have been announced for here in 2 months' time, which are kind of inconceivable in what they would really mean, but then nevertheless that are not attached to any like new man. I mean, you see it in the adverts and so on. It's like drinking too much beer on European holidays, and it's like it's a super grotesque middle brow kind of imaginary that doesn't have that aestheticization in that sense, right? So yeah, so I think it gets keyed in a different way. I think what's difficult is to really trace the exact impress of these collective temporal experiences, let's say, of stagnation and ecological threat, emergency, and collapse together on the mentality, on the mentalities, but also on the practices of the far right. That's kind of what I'm interested in sort of mapping out.
It's good, let him answer.
Well, if you want to respond to that, because I feel like it's.
Go for it.
A couple different things, Steph. I feel like first of all that when I first wrote about these people in 2021, that there really did feel to be like a kind of actual, properly intellectually vibrant set of debates taking place on the right that were actually playing out like in essays that were like interesting to read and well edited, and like you could see that this, which was basically that kind of conflict between an old fusionist conservative orthodoxy of the Reagan era, of what kind of combination of libertarian economics and Christian moralism and Cold War feudalism as, the three-legged stool of Reaganism, and people who tending to be younger people who saw in Trump and his sort of more isolationist, more nativist, less libertarian new consensus, which we could also see as sort of more like the paleoconservative revenge that they were having those debates with those people, and they were writing at they might have been at National Review where the consensus was fusionist, and so they had to fight in their pages of these magazines. And, you know, some of that stuff that was the era of American Affairs coming out and various, you know, that these feel like a real intellectual debate, even if there was a lot of stuff submerged that would have been more personal and more like all intellectual debates, a lot of pettiness that takes the form of intellectual disagreement. I think now, for one thing, on the actual ideological divides, I see it being a little bit more atmospheric. There's a huge divide between, especially before the election, between the black-pilled right and the white-pilled right, meaning the optimistic right and the pessimistic right. The white-pilled right were like, Trump's gonna win, we're gonna get everything we want. Like, it's gonna be great. And the black pillars were like, even if Trump does win, it's just gonna be, you know, he's an old boomer who's given over his campaign to, you know, billionaires, and nothing's really going to change. And also, he's not going to win. And then I think another huge one, again, it's more atmospheric, it's less clearly articulated, but the divides over gender and abortion are really big on the right now. On gender, there's one thing I heard a lot about was sort of about two perspectives on what's the problem with what's gone wrong with heterosexuality amongst you know, young people on the right talking about this, especially. And then there are those who kind of come at it from a more traditional social conservative background who would say that it's really about men being unshackled from traditional constraints and obligations implicitly by the sexual revolution. And without those norms, men are animals. They act like bores, and so the solution has to be a return to traditional social conservatism and the obligations that go with that, and really and also like the intervention of a church authority. But there's other people on the right who say that is just internalized feminism, and really that's just blaming men, once again blaming men. And why don't we look at the choices that women make, look at how they vote, look at how the kinds of relationships they seek out. This is kind of the misogynist incel perspective. And what I was thinking was interesting, in one of the talks this morning, there was a slide that had Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate as both representative of the kind of self-help, you know, cult on the right. But really for these two sides, Jordan Peterson is like more the first thing, because Jordan Peterson is just telling men, you know, clean up your rooms, you know, think about what your dad would want you to do. Whereas Andrew Tate is saying women are disgusting and awful, and, you know, do whatever you want and whatever happens in your life that makes you feel like you have an obligation to someone else, especially a woman, avoid that at all costs.
I have one tiny follow-up to David Bell. Aware that I suppressed it because it's so upsetting, but actually I have written about it on the Princeton University Press website under Eugenic Fantasies. Donald Trump has a grandnephew, William Trump, who is significantly disabled, some genetic condition, dearly loved by his mother, Fred Trump, the third, and the mother. And they are huge disability rights activists. And they, during the first Trump administration, brought many disability rights parents, activists to the White House. And Trump acted like he paid attention to them. And then the minute they left, the other parents left the room, he said to his nephew, the expense, the shape those people were in, maybe they should just die. Okay. And after he left the White House, and there was a long and complicated story, I don't want to get into it. Fred is the brother of Mary Trump, right? But there was a moment when the family money that they had been denied, which was supposed to go into William's care, he's now 25, he needs a lot of nursing care all the time, caused Fred to once again call Donald, who was on the golf course, and talk to him about the fact that there needed to be more money put into the slush fund or trust fund for the son. And Donald then actually said about William, maybe you should just let him die and move to Florida. Okay, so I actually think that this is a care crisis we're living through now. And mass murder as a response to a care crisis is something we have seen 100 years ago. And, you know, it's like, we need to take it seriously. that that is one impulse in people?
Yeah, question about this theme about disability and their treatment, also because you were asking the audience to. Oh, sorry.
Maybe stand up.
Yeah, maybe I should stand up.
More audience view.
Yes, and you were asking earlier, right, that the audience should respond to this debate about disability and why this treatment, this unkindly treatment. And in the discussion you were having now, it got me thinking that isn't it in a way also whether Trump or the AfD, aren't they also tapping into more general trends of unkindness that are very much anchored in the way the state and the economy has been working for the last 30 years, that of course the remarks that you just quoted from Trump are horrifying and shocking, but in the end it was what, 20, 30 years ago that the American government closed down psychiatric institutions and are leaving these people to die. So therefore, isn't also the AfD in a way in its treatment of disability also tapping into that and magnifying the cruelty also of the German state, not in any way exceptional to any other or most others, right? That in Germany, to get disability benefits, you have to jump to 300 hoops and hopefully get 800 euros at the end. And then you have to prove all this every 3 or 4 years over and over again. And so that this is, again, one of those cases where these far-right parties and the emotions that they evoke are feeding off something that exists more generally. And what do you think about that?
Well, it goes back to Charlotte's point about the damage that neoliberalism does,
exactly.
the austerity budgeting. So we've lived through 10, 15 years, max 20, of disability-friendly language. It's all very hip now to have your crib, whatever, but like to actually fund the care, you know, what care costs or what excellent integrated schooling costs, forget about it, right? So actually everyone is vulnerable. Everybody is in this competitive new thing and is fearful of being imperfect and vulnerable. And so that's why I sort of had those three things, like what's with the anxiety? Like, is this anxiety about not being smart enough? Is it flattering people? Well, at least I'm not, you know, moron. Or is it actually teaching cruelty? And I think it's doing all three of those things. And that's one of the reasons it's so incredibly effective. But I really have come to think that they are basically teaching cruelty and showing that it's okay to want to invisibilize imperfection.
I have a question for Alberto. I was thinking more and more about racial pessimism, the different kinds of pessimisms that you were just talking about. I'm wondering whether pessimism is the right word. I mean, for example, Wotan, yes, he wants everyone to die. That's also a moment of his triumph, you know, in that Wagnerian game. And for the Great Replacement theory, it's actually a kind of optimistic narrative in a way, well, because optimistic in the sense in which it's requiring people to take political action. So there's a certain optimism that the white race deserves to be protected, must be protected, is the best, is in crisis. So even within its kind of, you know, gloomy picture of the world, there's a fundamental optimism about whiteness. And I see that in Dagmar's material, all the sort of sexy fascists, you know, dancing around remigration. So I'm wondering whether optimism and pessimisms might be the wrong coordinates, or if they are the correct coordinates, how can we think about the optimism that underlies pessimism in this politics?
That's a really interesting point. In part, I'm just working with the fact that this is a term that these fascists themselves use, right? So that there's a, it's not just one strand, but there's various families in the interwar far right, literary, ideological, so on, that very much stress what they see as a pessimism, whose counter is not optimism per se, but is progress, humanism, and whether in a liberal or socialistic guise. And there's a kind of freeing that happens, I think, in that explicit delinking from, post and partly pseudo-Nietzschean delinking from Christianity and socialism, right? The idea is that, the idea is that, of course we will, the white race is not eternal. None of them believe it, right? And fascism is not eternal either. It might be 1,000 years, but then that's, the sense that, and that is partly linked to the spectacularization and to this sense of performance and tragedy and drama that various people kind of underscore. So in part, I think there is that like philosophical and partly Nietzschean notion of pessimism as a kind of life philosophy that can also be activist, sacrificial, Furio Iesi writes about this in terms of the Italian like dissident far right of the 70s that basically sees their far left counterparts, the Marini, Red Brigade, etc., as people who are still basically have not engaged in the transvaluation of values. They still believe like there will be a functioning socialist state. And there's instead like a kind of active nihilism, an embrace of finitude, death, sacrifice, etc., that has a place. I'm not saying this is what gets you 52% of the popular vote or whatever, right? Like, but it is like an important kind of component that I'm interested in. And I think then, and I know, for instance, in a book that just came out, but I haven't read, but I have some sketchy idea of by Richard Seymour on disaster nationalism. I think there's a lot of people trying to figure out exactly, also what are these underlying libidinal dynamics that combine, and that's the feeling of social catastrophe that Adorno is getting at, that combine the anticipation of crisis, like only we can save you, only Trump will fix it, or etc., with something else that is sometimes not quite avowed, which is an orientation towards catastrophe, perhaps towards the license that allows, and also the fact that if there is a crisis, then we, the catastrophe gives, or the coming catastrophe gives you a license, right? Extreme situations demand extreme measures. It allows also the breaking of certain, moral inhibitions or censures, etc. So I think that also plays a role. So I think pessimism and optimism are obviously like non-concepts in many ways that are deeply incoherent, etc. But I do find that specific notion of what is the politics that's predicated, the racial pessimism, right? Like what is the politics that's predicated on this notion of inevitable and coming collapse and decline, right? It's not, and that's where you get the dispute, of course, between even Spengler and the Nazis, right? Because they're like, even the ones who believe it are like, this is terrible politics to say you're engaging in a politics in view of the complete collapse of your civilization, even if it's in 200 years, right? That doesn't, it's not popular.
All right, so we're about 20 minutes out, so I'm going to start grouping the questions in threes. So would you like to ask your first one?
Well, I'll go very quick. Alberto, you were talking about pessimism and optimism, and it made me think of a question for Dagmar, because the French, you put in your slide, you talk about 1918, the famous the Western world putting everything on top of the German, and the Germans said we need to reclaim our dignity. But the German did that to the French in 1871. So why the French came out with La Commune, optimism word, socialism, basically let's be good, and the German suddenly you talk about cruelty and all that thing and pessimism. What happened? I mean, we have two functions where one country against the other, they've been fighting for 1,000 years, since 300 or 400. So what is make it today in 2014, 2024, that cruelty we see coming out of the AFD, and actually through the disability world, suddenly we can see that cruelty, like you just open a sun in front of me with the cruelty. And suddenly I was thinking of those two dates. That's my question, but sorry.
Well, cruelty in the Dreyfus Affair.
Yes, actually,
In the glasses.
Yeah, I have a question for Dagmar. Also, sorry, many questions for you. Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering for the German case, and you're talking about inclusion in schools, like especially for Baden-Württemberg, so the southwest of Germany, I know, like that actually the rates of inclusion are comparably high. But in fact, that is not actual inclusion that is happening there, but what they are doing is actually redefining the pupils that are already there in school and defining them as inclusion pupils to get money for school. And I think that is very interesting because, of course, these students that are affected by that are very often students from troubling social backgrounds or refugee students who are now defined as disabled or getting inclusion. And I was wondering how, like, this connection or how the AFD is maybe actually using them in connecting refugee background, social struggling background with disability by these, what is actually happening in schools.
I think one more question.
I know that the role of women is going to be a subject for later in the afternoon, but I still have a question about your perceptions of the role, participation of women in the sorts of ideologies and attitudes. But so Sam, among the young radicals that you've been talking to, are there women? Do they share the same attitudes that you've mentioned? And to Dagmar, I wonder if women who are in the AFD or support the AFD also share that same hostility to the disabled.
I mean, I'm going to let David have answered this question about the French. I mean, they were cruel in the Dreyfus affair. I mean, when a group is defeated, there are different ways to react. But I would say that there is a coincidence in time between the rise of eugenics internationally, also in the US, also in England, everywhere. But the Germans are the ones who lost World War I, and they didn't take it very well. Okay, so I really believe that the hostility, the new lies that the cognitive disability is biologically transmitted, and the insistence on that aspect, and the fantasies that they should sterilize 20 or 30% of their fellow citizens, that's distinctive, right? And it's very similar to the stab in the back myth that blames the Social Democrats and Jews. Narcissistic wound is crucial, I think. In terms of Catalina's point about, actually, I have to say, Baden-Württemberg, the last statistics are 32% are included versus Bremen, which has 90%. It really varies. But I agree with you that one of the techniques that German school systems are using are redefining kids that are just having a little bit of emotional behavioral issues or are like slightly slow or challenged or whatever, and redefining them as learning disabled or needing some sort of supports in order to get more teachers and more money. There's no question that that tactic is happening. But in fact, those who are most significantly disabled are being shunted into the segregated special schools. So that is a complicated story, but I would say one of the sort of obvious things, what causes cognitive disability is poverty, and it has for hundreds of years. I mean, basically, back in the day before antibiotics, the childhood fevers of encephalitis and meningitis, that's what caused 10-15% of children with cognitive disability came from the upper classes. Everybody else was poor. And it's always been a poverty management issue. And since we've had guest workers and migrants in Germany, it's been a triangular relationship. And Germany is very invested, with the exception of Hessen and a few other places, in its three-tiered system: gymnasium for the elite, basically the Realschule for the white collar, and then the Hauptschule. And then there were always two tiers below it. Learning disabled, they're basically going to be a little bit poorer than blue collar workers, and then those who really cannot work, who are significantly disabled. So it's really a five-tier system. And that had everything to do with the triangular relationship with migration and poverty. So yes, of course, the AFD is playing on the overlaps between migrant, oh, they don't speak German, right? Or, oh, they're not integrated, or, oh, their culture, their parents are education far, Bildungsfern and so on, uneducated parents, all those cliches are there. But the whole thing is rooted in an obsession with smartness and a desire to not have children be in the same school with the most who are most vulnerable and therefore learn solidarity and empathy. That is what is, if you force people into segregated settings, you keep them invisible, then the other ones, the ones you're trying to train into being little far right monsters are not going to learn solidarity. It is quite deliberate. And I realized it when I studied what the Nazis taught children about how to be cruel to the most vulnerable. And suddenly I realized, oh my God, that's what they're doing now too. Women in the AFD absolutely share it. They absolutely share the smartness talk.
Oh, I feel like mostly the next talk is going to be so good on that question about, I mean, certainly there are women involved in the spaces that I was mostly talking to people. I talked to some women. I mean, one thing that I will note about the specific kind of the DC staffer conservative movement world is that women have always been actively recruited, particularly welcome and given leadership roles in the pro-life movement for reasons of their own experience. They want that's something important to them, but also obviously for propaganda reasons. It's very helpful for the right to have their women leading their pro-life organizations. I think something that's interesting that is happening now, that we're all going to have to watch, is that from the standpoint of a lot of people in the conservative movement, the pro-lifers did not act appropriately, tactically, strategically enough during the election. I mean, it was okay because they won, but people in the Trump right were very angry because they told this pro-lifers, "Shut up, we gave you what you wanted. Stop talking about this." And from the perspective of a lot of people in the Trump tactical mind trust, they felt the pro-lifers were kind of still talking about abortion too much. Basically, they wanted to and that's what the whole Project 2025 conflict was over. Trump was like, why did you write down all this crazy stuff we want to do about abortion? So the relative power of the Christian pro-life right in this coming White House is kind of up for grabs and more contested than you might imagine.
A comment, which is actually on the back of the Franco-German question, because it reminded me of something about and partly goes back to the question around varieties of pessimism. Nietzsche, like Jakob Burckhardt, thought that the Communards had set the Louvre on fire. This was a famous fake news that circulated, and people have studied it and had like a lot of fake news, remarkable staying power regardless of it's not happening. And Nietzsche talks about this in the introduction of the Birth of Tragedy and elsewhere as being, one of the occasioning forces behind his writing and behind this formulation of a kind of tragic pessimism that centers on the valorizing capacities of great art and so on. And what, the argument for the horrors of commune understood as the dilapidation of European culture, right? As barbarism and obviously in a kind of, often in those discourses, a racialized barbarism, right? So that the communards are also, in some sense, savages, and all of that language of colonial language enters into and for Nietzsche, the culprit is optimism. The culprit is optimism because he says all these ideas of progress percolated to the rabble, whose only reaction to this, mirage or promise of progress is to, set cultural light and so on. And so in that narrative also that we find, in the fantasy space of the far right, the relationship between, their sort of cultural Marxist idea of DI as this sort of Angela Davis, Herbert Marcuse 60-year plot to undo America or whatever, being, well, that's what makes something like the George Floyd rebellion possible, right? And it's like, so there's this constant link between social unrest and the idea that there are these bad, progressive, liberal, leftist ideas that somehow unchecked, right, will cause, a key disaster. And it's interesting that the 1870s, the sense that the Paris Commune is a sign, right, of the collapse of Europe, capital E, is then sort of revisited and rearticulated in a different pessimistic vein in the sense that, the colored world revolution, right? You know, it is such also sign of this premonitory sign of this decline, and then this kind of emergency, you know, like salvage or emergency politics, which sometimes presents itself as knowing it won't succeed, but that the fight is good anyhow, right? That's very evident in Spengler, right? He has this crazy passage, I think it's at the end of Men and Technics, where he says, you know, what is the image? You know, since we know that the West will decline, you know, what is the image of heroism? And he has this, says, oh, you know those, there's this petrified, I think it's an amazing passage. It's like there's that, with the volcanic eruption in Pompeii, right? Like one of the petrified human bodies was a guard, and even though he knew the volcano was coming, he stood at his, you know, it's like the most fascist fantasy, right? It's like you die for nothing, but, you know, heroically. And that is something that Yezi in his book on right-wing culture, I think really grasps, right? There is this moment of like useless sacrifice, but never like heroic useless sacrifice, which is one of the fantasies, not necessarily the dominant one, that makes for this kind of pessimist activism that one can find on the far right.
So I wanted to ask a question about, I mean, to riff off of Alberto's reference to Raymond Williams, the spread, if we're going to use this epidemiological metaphor, the spread of structures of unfeeling actually, and how this sort of, the spread of the ability to not feel empathy proliferates. And Dagmar, I was so struck by your introducing of Roediger's work, The Wages of Whiteness, the sentiment that I am at least white in German society. I wonder if actually what we're experiencing is not I am at least white, but I am at least not Black in the American context. I am at least not a migrant in the German context. I am at least not Palestinian in the Israeli context. The reason I say that is I'm drawing on Claire Jean Kim's work on the LA riots and the sort of failures of racial empathy, let's say, or solidarity even more between Koreans and Black Americans at that time. And I wonder if thinking about the intimacies between Asian American or model minority, let's say more broadly, racial ressentiment, and what folks in Germany are experiencing might be a productive way to think about these structures of unfeeling, because if there's any American obsession with intelligence, it's around debates around affirmative action. And this idea, this bullshit idea, frankly, that I can say as an Asian American, that Asian Americans are smarter and yet aren't getting the success that we so-called deserve, right? And so what I wonder is that it's, at least in the American context, right? Because I'm much less familiar with the German one as you are, that the conversion of the I am at least not Black into disability is actually not I am at least abled, but rather in a sense, either I am at least not disabled because we're all, as Berlant knew, in various states of debility, right? If disability is defined as the inability to work, we're all able to work, but sort of debilitated in some sense in doing so. Or even more insidiously, I am at least debilitated in the sense that there is almost a wish, a nihilistic wish to be disabled, to be so-called crippled, because the ressentiment is around this idea, like the welfare queen, that there is a population out there that is receiving benefits that I wish I could have, right? And I think that the sort of model minority like mentality kind of feeds off of that, right? Like I wish that I didn't have to work, right? Which is the definition of disability, David Harvey's at least, right? I wish I didn't have to work, but I have to. In fact, I have to work twice as hard to get what all of these sort of other minorities get. So yeah, I just wanted to ask that about this sort of intimate psychic resemblances between the American and German racial.
I take it about a macro level question to think about the implications of the three of your presentations for what I would say right now is the prevailing explanation for the rise of the populist right globally, which is that it grows out of economic dislocations and class resentments. Right? We have a kind of I would say, a simple economic determinism coming from both parts of the left, Bernie, Jacobin, et cetera, but also, maybe a little more improbably coming from large parts of the center, you know, Clintonites, for example, moving that to the foreground of their explanations for what's happened in 2016, what's happening now. And so I'm interested and those also, of course, lead to a whole suite of class-based solutions, largely focusing not on class as such, but focusing segments of the working class population that is supposedly at the heart of the rise of this new right populism. That is white working class men who are usually typed as standing in for class generally. And so I'm interested in the implications of your arguments for both the explanation and the supposed antidotes to the rise of the populist right, since it's so ubiquitous right now. And you're offering, I think, at least a great complication to that framework.
Got the final question.
I'm not sure it merits it being, but I just had a question about the kind of IQ, the way it's played out even in this election, because there's obviously multiple threads there, historical and otherwise, but I wonder how it maps onto the electoral coalitions that Trump in America, but maybe also more broadly on the right in general, has tapped into, where it's a way of saying to those who uneducated voters, Trump, Biden, love the uneducated. It's a way of sort of appealing to people's or appears to be a way of tapping into a way of being intelligent that has nothing to do with credentials or education. And sort of saying, hey, you know, Kamala Harris has all the degrees you could want and all the success you could want, but she's not that bright, and Jeb Bush is not that bright and pretty low energy. And if that's part of the appeal of low IQ that maps onto some kind of class or other appeal of the populist, right? If that's a factor in the analyses you guys have.
Thank you for reminding us of that thing about I love the uneducated or the undereducated or the non-college educated. I think that's obviously Trump's thing. But have you noticed the shift recently towards, you know, Musk is a genius? I mean, that is like the most recent move is towards that. You know, the Joe Rogan interview is where he said that Kamala is low IQ. And now he's praising Musk. So it's been a shift away from the I love the undereducated or uneducated. Look, I think the thing about anti-disability hostility, and I would specify cognitive disability as a special category of that we've sort of lumped together with crip theory, but we really should take it apart. And then I think within that we have gradations of it, which is also un-PC to talk about. But I think that there is something deep in human nature that course resents when you're working and other people or someone getting away with not working, right? So that is there. And then there's another thing that's sort of deep in human nature, which is getting tapped all the time, which is a sense of superiority to those who are not as swift, right? So, I mean, I don't know if I should tell the story in this setting, but basically a professional that I know heard me speak about my work, and it was about, you know, the whole 20th century in Germany, and I had defined fascism as trampling on weakness and disdain and contempt for weakness as one of its major features, and one of the ways you recognize a fascism when you see one. He came up to me afterwards and said, brilliant stuff, Dagmar, thank you so much, but I'm a liberal and I have contempt for weakness. I don't agree with your definition of fascism. And I found that enormously helpful because I think that it gets at why this is so tappable in people, right? I just think that's the point. And yeah, I don't know if there's more to say about it, but I would say also that I really feel strongly that poverty and being deemed cognitively not so swift and all totally overlaps. And of course, one of the long-standing, Rodiger is totally relevant here with the wages of whiteness, because the long-standing question is, why is there not a socialist movement in the United States? And we've always said, well, people got paid in the wages of whiteness, Black and white laborers didn't, you know, get to be in solidarity with each other. But there is also a way in which, you know, basically helping you feel like you're at least smart, you're at least not a disabled person, you're not requiring care. There's a discomfort with social welfare, even though it's actually in the red states that more people depend on food stamps, et cetera. It's one of those paradoxes. But ambivalence about being vulnerable is is a very tappable thing. And the last thing I wanted to do, and I don't know if you guys saw it in my slides, but there's a woman, a Franziska Schutzbach, who's a German-speaking, Swiss-employed sociologist, says anti-PC rhetoric and the bashing of do-gooders. We can put together anti-DEI stuff with, hostility to feminism, with hostility to the disabled, because it's basically the bashing of do-gooders who are trying to make you be nice and kind to those who are vulnerable, right, is ultimately a subtle strategy used to fend off the politics of responsibility and the creation of equal opportunities. Maintaining and defending hierarchies and inequality is presented as a defense of freedom of speech, freedom of whatever, while all those who want to make a broader range of options for all possible are accused of enforcing conformity and totalitarianism. I do think this is a battle over kindness. And obviously, I spent a lot of time in the last weeks looking at what people who are pro-Trump are getting in their ads and in their social media feeds and so on, and they were clearly marinating in lies, about the Democrats and what they offer. But ultimately, nobody could miss the cruelty in Trump's speech, and that's what people voted for. And we have to think about why that is. The pleasure in cruelty is something that we just need to confront.
I think that's such an important perspective. It also does make me think of though about the obverse, right?
Right,
Which
pleasure and
is
sympathy, pleasure and solidarity.
or concerned, accompanied by complicity in the worst atrocities one can imagine, performed as empathy,
Yeah.
kindness, etc. Right? And I think that's also very jarring and very symbolically corrosive, right?
Because then people
when
can
you
say, oh,
know,
you're so hypocritical.
yeah,
So
when you know
think
the
you're acting-
violence and
yeah.
then you know,
Act like you're concerned, but you're not doing
Yeah.
anything. You're not stopping
we've
the
seen
sentence.
too many
Okay.
deaths in Gaza. It's like,
Yeah. Okay.
you haven't
But that's
seen them
different
clearly, right?
from
But I'm just
what
saying
could
it's
be
like-
the pleasure of
yeah.
genuine empathy and solidarity.
Oh, yes,
Which
yes,
we know
yeah.
is possible. We
Yeah.
remember there was a decade when
No.
that was actually more.
For sure, for sure. No, I just meant that in terms of like the establishment effective landscape or the set of options, unfortunately, it seemed that the license to be cruel is accompanied by, is countered by largely by the performance of being concerned rather than by the actual reality or indeed the pleasure of kindness or care, right?
Or care. Well, I don't know. That's,
think,
we can talk about left versus liberal versus.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I thought that formulation of the structures of unfeeling was really perceptive. And I was also trying to think, well, how do these also vary historically or conjuncturally, right? You have certain, you have a variety which is like the license to cruelty, the freeing, which is so important in the delegation of violence that goes along with many kind of fascist processes. Then at the same time, the unfeeling can be seen as a kind of discipline, right? Like the horrendous, Himmler speech about decency, right? You've remained decent, right? Some have gone astray, but you remain decent, right? Like, so I think there's these histories and politics of the far, there are different varieties of unfeeling and cruelty that get articulated, also because of all of these contradictions. I mean, I was so struck with that contradiction between the communalist and the licentious, right?
Yeah.
That in many ways the far right always has to hold together in volatile emotional coalitions, right? Because those are two aspects that, certainly in the.
I'm
So Zizek
nostalgic
in the
for
90s would have
Sam.
something to say about this.
But I mean, Sam's people 5 years ago, when you first spoke with them, they were not hostile to the disabled. I mean, I would say there was a Christian sentimentality, both in Catholic circles and Protestant, that was,
Oh, yeah.
very strong, and we're way past that.
I do think that there's still people in that world. They often express it through their pro-life politics and anti-eugenic, anti-politics, but that's not Trump.
Right,
Trump's
that's
the
right.
other side. Trump's the
Right.
licensed cruelty,
That's right.
licensed enjoyment.
That's right.
Well, I hope that we can take a little break and thank you so much to our panelists.